when you take a keen interest in historical events, sometimes it is good to review and refresh your thoughts on what you think may have taken place at a particular time in history. So it is with that once again I find myself down on the fields of Bannockburn. Now the film you're about to watch, it's a long film. It is not an analytical analysis of what happened on the 23rd and 24th of June 1314 at the Battle of Bannockburn. But it's an overview of what unfolded on those 2 days. And it's a consideration of some of the facts, some of the chroniclers who wrote about it at the time, and some of my views about what was pertinent to the battle, which may highlight just where the epicentre of day 2 of the battle took place, the significant and defining day of the Battle of Bannockburn. So join me, pour a coffee, sit back and watch this film, and perhaps together we can put together the parts of the jigsaw that confirm, as many others believe, that once and for all we have identified the place where day 2 of the Battle of Bannockburn has taken place. Have a great day. Hello, I hope this finds you well. Welcome back to the Spirit of Scotland. This morning I've brought you to the Milton Ford on the Bannockburn as a small recap as to where we were in our quest to find the epicentre of day 2 of the Battle of Bannockburn. Now the Milton Ford here, in all probability, was a place where the English army crossed on day 1 of the battle. The English Earls Hereford and Gloucester would have crossed here on their way to try to relieve Stirling Castle behind me here. However, they were met by Robert the Bruce and the Scottish army on their route down towards the castle, and they were effectively routed from the field and pushed back across the Bannockburn here. Another 2 English Earls, Clifford and Beaumont, went further north and tried to circumnavigate the Scottish army to come in behind them, cutting them off. But they were met by the Scottish knight Thomas Randolph, who also routed the English cavalry, sending them scattering, some towards the castle and others back towards the main body of their army. The question is, where did the English army go after they had been defeated on day 1? They had to camp and bivouac for the night. Well, we can find the answer to that in the chronicles, and it's quite clear in the chronicles, which we're going to have a look at, where they camped for the evening. So here's a quick recap of day 1 of the battle, where you can visualise it in map form, so you can see in your mind's eye what went on that day on day 1. So here we have the main body of the English army, who had approached Stirling Castle through the Torwood from Falkirk area up the old Roman road. They were preceded by the Earl of Gloucester and Hereford, who were in the vanguard of the English army. They were out in front of the main body, and they crossed the Bannockburn, ostensibly en route to Stirling Castle. But they were met by Robert the Bruce himself and his troops, and it was in this area that de Boon, the English knight, was slain by Bruce himself. As Gloucester and Hereford tried to proceed up the road, the Scottish troops confronted them and routed Gloucester and Hereford's cavalry, sending them packing back over the Bannockburn. At roughly the same time, 2 other English knights with 300 cavalry, Clifford and Beaumont, took the low road down onto the Carse, along the Carse, and tried to come in behind the Scots in a classic pincer movement. Now, some people believe that they were en route to relieve the castle, but you have to ask, why would they take 300 mounted cavalry up to relieve the castle when the castle custodian, Mowbray, already considered it relieved? And Additionally, this was mounted cavalry, where Thomas Randolph, who is the Earl of Moray, his troops who came down to meet him were foot soldiers. So realistically, if Clifford and Beaumont had wanted to get up to the castle, they could have just quite easily rode around the Earl of Moray and his troops and up to Stirling Castle, but they didn't. They chose to confront them. Thomas Randolph, who is the Earl of Moray, came down onto the plain below St Ninians and met Clifford and Beaumont's cavalry, about 300 of them. They formed up their schiltron and were attacked by the English troops, but they were resolute and held firm. And as time went on and the troops, the cavalry, tired, Moray and his troops advanced onto them, effectively routing them, sending some on towards Stirling Castle, and the rest retreated back to the main body of the English army. So they were routed on day one, and thereafter, in the afternoon and the evening, they proceeded down onto the Carse to camp for the evening. So let's take a look at where we think they may have gone. So here's a clearer map which gives a much wider perspective of where we are. At the top here we have the River Forth, into which the Bannockburn flows. This is the Bannockburn down here, and one of the tributaries of the Bannockburn is the Pelstream Burn, which plays an important part in the story that we are telling today. Here are the main body of the English army, and here is the Roman road along which they travelled on day one of the battle. And this is the area which Gloucester and Hereford travelled to confront King Robert the Bruce and the Scottish troops, and were routed and sent back over the Bannockburn. And down on the Carse, this is the area that Clifford and Beaumont followed and were met by Thomas Randolph, the Earl of Moray, and routed and sent packing back over the Bannockburn. So where did the main body of the English troop go to? Well, we know that they went and camped on the Carse that night. How do we know that? Well, there was an English knight called Thomas Grey, who was a prisoner in Edinburgh Castle, and he was the son of his father, also called Thomas Grey, who fought and was captured by the Scots at the Battle of Bannockburn. And he wrote, "Some of whom, the English, fled to the castle, others to the king's army, which having already left the road through the wood had debauched upon a plain near the water of Forth, beyond the Bannockburn, an evil, deep, wet marsh, where the said English army unharnessed and remained all night, having sadly lost confidence and being too much disaffected by the events of the day." So they debauched upon a plain near the water of Forth. Are there any other chroniclers mentioned camping on the Carse? Well, John Barber was a Scottish poet and the Archdeacon of Aberdeen Diocese. And he wrote in his poem The Bruce, this part about the English king: "Meantime their king resolved in council not to fight, unless compelled ere morning light. So there throughout the night they stayed, camped in the Carse, and ready made, that they might, when morning came, be well in order for war's game." So once again, camped in the Carse and ready made. So we know beyond any reasonable doubt that the main body of the English army, after they were routed on day one of the battle, went down onto the Carselands and camped for the night. Now the question is, which part of the Carseland, because it is fairly extensive. If we can resolve where they camped, we can pretty much ascertain where the epicentre of day 2, the significant and defining day of the battle, took place. So where are the two principal areas? The English army would have travelled down this area, down a fairly steep slope, which would have been difficult for the baggage train to manage. And they could have crossed here, a place I've called the Thunder Ford, which is in the area where the modern railway crosses the Bannockburn. And the railway bridge is called by the locals Thunder Bridge because of the noise of the train going across it. So I've called it the Thunder Ford. So they could cross here and come into this area of the Carseland between the Pell Stream and the Bannockburn here. Alternatively, they could go up the east side of the Bannockburn, past Redhall Farm, and cross the tidal area of the Bannockburn onto the plain here, near Taylorton, Upper Taylorton Farm and Balquhdderock Farm, and the area of Spring Carse. As Thomas Gray says, they debauched upon a plain near the water of the Forth. So which one do I think they camped overnight on, and why? Well, let's have a look at that on another map and explain the reasons why. One of the foremost historians who proposed that the English camped on the Carse on the eve of day 2 of the battle, and that the battle was down on the Carse on day 2 of the Battle of Bannockburn, was William M. Mackenzie, who in his book The Battle of Bannockburn, which was published in 1913, proposed, as was said by Thomas Gray in the Scala Chronica, that the English had debauched upon a plain near the water of the Forth. Now we can see here that Mackenzie has the English camp between the River Forth and the Bannockburn. Here's the estuary, and here is the Bannockburn here. And he proposes that the battle took place from here down to where you see the Scots. It's Robert Douglas, the Earl of Moray, and Edward Bruce, and the camp followers. Now, you may notice an omission from Mackenzie's map, and that is of the Pell Stream burn. It isn't here. Now, the Pell Stream, the confluence of which goes into the Bannockburn in this area here, and the Pell Stream would run along here up to this area here. So it would split the Scottish forces as Mackenzie has them drawn on his map. And there's nothing in any of the chronicles anywhere that suggests that the Scottish forces were split across the Pell Stream. Indeed, it would be a tactical error to do so, and Bruce was known for his tactical astuteness and surely would not be so silly to make that mistake. And as I've said, it is not mentioned in any of the chronicles anywhere. So for me, that is a huge omission from Mackenzie's interpretation of how the battle unfolded on day 2. I also have another problem with where he has the English camp. Now, they would have travelled up the burn, the east side of the burn, and crossed between the Forth and the Bannockburn. Now, from this area here, as it flows to its estuary, this is tidal. And from here going southwards, this is fresh water. Some people debate as to just how high the tidal area of the Bannockburn came up in 1913, some proposing it came up as far as Redhall Farm, which is here. But having looked into it, I can find no evidence anywhere, no conclusive evidence, that the tidal limit was any higher back in 1314 than it is today. and the tidal limit is at the confluence between the Pell Stream and the Bannockburn. This area here was a floodplain back in 1913. The banks of the Forth have since been built up to a considerable height, and quite a bit of this land here has been reclaimed. Now Mackenzie has the pools in this floodplain area and dotted around on the banks of the River Forth. Now these may well have been flooded areas full of brackish water. So that creates another problem, doesn't it? Now the English cavalry, their heavy horse, numbered about 2,000. And one of their great needs after the exertions that they had had on June the 23rd, the first day of the battle, having walked to the battle from the Falkirk area, taken part and been routed on day one of the battle, one of the priorities of those horses would be to get fresh water. Now, would you risk having your horses drink from these brackish pools, potentially giving them all colic on the eve of a great battle? I think that would be foolish. These war horses were very expensive and hard to come by, and they would have been well looked after by their knights and their squires. So why would they allow them to drink out of brackish pools adjacent to a tidal area of the Bannockburn and a tidal area of the Forth, where fresh water would not be easy to come by? They would have to cross the Pell Stream or use the Pell Stream to get fresh water from the Bannockburn or an area of the Pell Stream. It's a nuisance to do so when they could be in another area. Now, how much would these horses drink? A medieval war horse would be about 15 hands high, and it would require a conservative estimate after the exertions that they've had on the 23rd of June, at least 40 litres of water to quench their thirst. Now, given that they've got 2,000 cavalry there, and this isn't even including the backup horses which each knight would have had, they would have had a courser perhaps, a speedy horse, a palfrey, a comfortable horse for riding during the day, and their war horse, which was for the battle. And they would have had the horse and the oxen that were pulling the baggage train for the food, the camp followers, the tents, etc. There may well have been 4,000 horse and oxen there that day. But if we stick to the cavalry alone, about 2,000 of them there, 40 litres each, that's 80 metric tonnes of water, fresh water required for these horses. Now I would contend that this would not be a convenient area for them to camp. These brackish pools would not provide the fresh water suitable for the horses. If they were to take it, it could lead to a serious case of colic and render the horses useless the next day for the battle. So they would have used fresh water, in my opinion. So for a number of reasons, one, the Pell Stream splitting the Scottish forces, if the battle is as Mackenzie highlights it here, the lack of fresh water in the area between the Forth and the Bannockburn. Remember, this is a tidal area of the Bannockburn. And indeed, the difficulty in getting across here. It's just a bit too far. Why would they walk past perfectly good fresh water to get to an area that doesn't have it? It doesn't make sense. Now, some people do say that, of course, they were looking for security. They were flanked on one side by the Forth and on the other side by the Bannockburn. It protected them from a surprise Scots attack. Well, I would contend it's unlikely that the Scots would try to come around the east side, and they had nothing on this side of the Forth other than a baggage train at Cambus Kenneth Abbey. So it doesn't make sense that they camped in this area to me. So given that that's the case, where do I think they did camp? So here we have another map, more focused on a particular area. So let me describe where we are. Here you see the main road from Falkirk to Stirling, crossing the Bannockburn here. Adjacent to the road crossing you see the Milton Ford, and that goes on upwards past St Ninians and onwards up to Stirling Castle. This is a Dryfield area, and this is the main body of the English army, travelling along the road just discussed. Now you'll remember the vanguard, the elite, the cavalry, crossed ahead of the main body, crossed the Bannockburn on the 23rd of June, and in this area they met Robert the Bruce and the Scottish army. And if you remember, Hereford and Gloucester were routed from the field and sent back packing over the Bannockburn towards the main body of the English army. And the other two earls, if you remember, Clifford and Beaumont, they tried to circumnavigate the Scots, going down over the ford here, round on the Carse, and they were met here by the Earl of Moray, Thomas Randolph, who also routed them from the field, some going on towards Stirling Castle and others back towards the main body of the English army. So the English army had a choice to make after they'd been routed on day one of the battle. Do they continue as they had originally intended along the road, or do they go down onto the Carse and camp for the evening? Well, that's the decision they made. They decided to reconvene and continue the battle the next day. So they travelled down the slope here, down past Greenyards, which would be a fairly difficult and slippy crossing for the baggage train. It's downhill here, and you come down eventually where this green area goes into the beige area. This is the Carse. But as you can see, at the foot of the slope, there was an area of many, many tens of metres of peat-covered moss and bog, and that would be extremely difficult for a heavy baggage train to cross. There was many pools down here, and it would be, as I say, very boggy and marshy. So we know from the chronicles that people came down from the castle, the garrison, the English garrison came down from the castle with thatch and shutters and any other things they could find to lay across the pools, to bridge them, to make it easy for the baggage train to get across here. So is this the area described by Thomas Gray, remember the Scala Chronica, where they said they debauched upon a plain near the water of Forth, beyond the Bannockburn, an evil, deep, wet marsh, where the said English army unharnessed. And where John Barber said, so there throughout the night they stayed, camped in the Carse and ready made for battle the next day. So yes, I think this is the evil, deep, wet marsh that they've had to cross. Now, as I said, this would extend for many tens of metres into the flat Carseland area. But the further north you go, the drier and better it gets, onto the hard field here. And as you get up to this area here, it's quite hard and flat and much more conducive to camping. So are there any other things here that make it conducive to camping? Well, yes. Remember we talked about the need for fresh water for the horses. The cavalry alone was around 2,000, each horse requiring 40 litres, 80,000 litres, 80 metric tonnes of water. So here we have the Pell Stream burn, and at this point it's all fresh water. At the confluence here with the Bannockburn, this is a high most spring water tidal limit here. It gets no higher back in 1314 than it does today. And here is the Bannockburn, fresh water again. So they're camped between two freshwater sources, which makes it really conducive for the horse and the cavalry. And also, you've got to remember, they had other horse and oxen which pulled the baggage train, and the men would need watered as well. So they need considerable amounts of water, and they have it here on both sides. It also provides them with a bit of protection on both sides, their flanks being protected from perhaps a night attack from the Scottish army. So they considered this a good place to camp. And previous English armies had camped here under Edward I. So this was an area that was known to them. So what about the size of the area? Would it be suitable for 20,000 of an army to camp? They would be spread out with their tents, their fires, their cooks, their fletchers, their blacksmiths. All these people would need a certain amount of area. Well, this map is diagrammatic in form, but it is relatively to scale. And if you consider that, this area between the Pell Stream and this part called the Great Bend and the Bannockburn is about 800 yards. So I've drawn these English tents, the rectangular area, minus the canopy, minus the roof, is equal in size to what Tynecastle, the heart of Midlothian football ground, is. And that holds 20,000 people. Now they're hemmed in to watch a football match, and we realise that the camp would be spread out much more. But if you look at the area, that's relative in size to the Tynecastle football ground. I've put 3 in here. So effectively you could get 60,000 people from a football ground. You've got the space in between for horses, camps, fires, etc. It's just to give you a rough indication to let you see that there is more than enough room in here for 20,000 of a medieval army camp. So there you are. I believe that this area ticks all the boxes required for the English camp on the evening of the 23rd of June, prior to the battle next day on the 24th of June. So what else do we think happened that evening? Well, King Robert the Bruce had made the decision, after his successes on day 1, he had made the decision to confront the English the next day. And he has moved his troops down just south of the Balquhdderock wood to prepare for the next day. And as it was stated, once they emerged, on the morning of the 24th, they emerged from the trees to come out to confront the English troops. And they were surprised that the Scots had decided to meet them in the open field of battle, where under normal circumstances the cavalry would win the day. But they were in for a surprise that day, in the morning of the 24th of June. So let's look at where we think the battle took place. Some people believe it happened down on the Carse, and others would suggest that the English left the Carse and come up through here, through the trees, onto the Dryfield. So let's have a look, now that we have satisfied ourselves that they camped in the Carse between the Pell Stream and the Bannockburn.
The question is, what happened the next morning? Did the English stay down on the Carse and did the battle convene there? Or did they move from the Carse up to an area to the north of me here called the Dryfield, where some people think day 2 of the battle took place? Well, join me today as we go and look at these 2 areas, one of which we will dismiss as a potential day 2 of the battle, for some quite startling and obvious reasons. And we will then focus on the second area and see if we can pinpoint the epicentre where we think day 2 of the Battle of Bannockburn took place, the defining and significant day of the battle. So come and join me as we have a look in our quest to find day 2 of the Battle of Bannockburn. So here we are, down on the Carselands. given that we have established beyond doubt that the English did come down and bivouac here for the evening of the 23rd of June. And I'm at an area just north of the Balquhdderock wood, which is in the foreground here, and the Carse extends behind me to the River Forth to the north over my shoulder. So the English would have had to traverse this area on the way down to the Carselands to camp for the evening. And this area would have been wet, marshy and full of pools. How do we know this? Well, as mentioned in a previous video, Richard Tipping through Stirling University done a topographical study of this whole area, and he concluded that at the foot of the Balquhdderock wood, the runoff from the 30-degree slope there onto what would have been peat covered land here would result in kind of marshy, boggy, not very nice or easy area to traverse. And when you consider the English had 2,000 horse and they were all coming over this area, it would have turned into a bit of a quagmire. We know from the chronicles that English garrison from the castle had come down with thatch, window shutters, practically anything they could find to help with covering the pools of water in the marshy areas to aid the horse and the carriages get across. Once they were across this initial area, surprisingly, the further north you go towards the River Forth, the ground actually gets firmer and better and much more conducive for two things, I would suggest: camping and fighting, especially for cavalry. So this is the area immediately to the north of the Balquhdderock wood, and you've got to ask yourself, if they have gone to the trouble of traversing this marshy area with difficulty on the afternoon and evening of the 23rd of June, would they really want to disadvantage themselves on the morning of the 24th, the day of day 2 of the battle, by recrossing this marshy area, this quagmire which it would now be, by recrossing that at the slow pace and putting them at a disadvantage? They'd be sitting ducks for the Scots, wouldn't they? And once they got over this quagmire area, they would then be faced with a climb up through a 30-degree slope in a heavily wooded area. Once again, difficult for cavalry and infantry, and they could end up as sitting ducks. So let's go and have a look at the incline through the wooded area that they would need to go through. Okay, here we go, up through the Balquhdderock wood. It's about a 30-degree incline up here. Horses can get up here, no problem. Heavily armoured horses with armoured knights on them, and when there's around about 2,000 of them, that's a different matter. They would quickly churn this area up. And then with 20,000 troops on their tail, this would be a significant obstacle to any army on the move. It would slow them down. Now we know that battle was convened first thing in the morning at dawn, which is about 4:30 in the morning, midsummer. So do we think that the English got up, organised, crossed a quagmire, marched up a 30-degree slope through a heavily wooded area onto an area up here called the Dryfield, which they also know in certain areas had been laced with pits by the Scottish Army to catch out the cavalry? Do we really think that they've made that decision to come up here? It would be madness in the extreme. So it would. And here we are on the Dryfield. Now, supposing the English did march up here, they would find themselves at another disadvantage, because the Scots would have the high ground. Because the ground from here up to Milton and St Ninians, it's undulating, but generally sloping upwards. So their cavalry would be at a disadvantage. I don't see any reason whatsoever that the English army would move off the Carse and come up to this Dryfield to convene battle here on the morning of the 24th of June, when there were so many obstacles and disadvantages in their way. In my opinion, it quite simply does not make sense. And when we look further at the chronicles about how the battle took place and unfolded, we'll perhaps see more evidence of why I think it most definitely took place down on the Carse. So let's go down there and see if we can pinpoint where we believe the epicentre of the battle was. So here we are, down on the Carselands, between the Pell Stream and the Bannockburn. Pell Stream is about 500 metres to my left here, the Bannockburn about 300 metres to the east on my right. And isn't it incredible to think I may be standing in the place where King Robert the Bruce and the Scottish army came out from the woods and advanced boldly against the invading English army. Perhaps the largest invading English army that had ever come north into Scotland. And effectively, through the fantastic tactics of King Robert the Bruce, routed them from the field on that incredible day in Scottish history. So the Carseland is a vast area, difficult to see on film. So let's have a look at some maps and see if we can highlight what happened that day and put together the bits of the puzzle which can confirm, once again in my mind, where day 2 of the battle took place and what unfolded that day. And along with many others, we can, through weight of evidence, confirm once and for all that this is perhaps the most historic and defining place for what Scotland is as a nation in its history. So let's have a look. So here indeed is the map view of the Carse. Where you saw me standing was roughly in this area here. And as described when I was down on the Carse, we have the Pell Stream on one side of us, coming up here to its confluence with the Bannockburn, coming down here. So you can see the narrowness of the area between the Pell Stream and the Bannockburn, and indeed the distance between the Pell Stream here and what's called the Great Bend in the Bannockburn is about 800 yards. So line abreast, 1 metre apart, 800 Scots, 10 deep, would equate to 8,000 of an army. Would you need them 10 deep? Probably, to resist the charge of the English heavy cavalry. The English seen here, in red and white, they are obviously constricted. They can't get round to outflank the Scots army, can't outflank them on either side, because of the burns, making it, if not impossible, at least extremely difficult to get around and outflank them. So, with the woods here, the narrowness of the field and the position of the two armies, is there anything in the chronicles that tells us that this reflects what may have happened on the day? Well, let's go to John Barber and see what he says. So, taken from his poem The Bruce. This starts describing the Scots, and it's a fairly extensive quote, but it sets the scene for what we see in front of us. Soon as they saw the morning light, the Scottish men, when it was day,
devoutly knelt the mass to say, and after prayer they took some food, and then in battle order stood, all in their several troops arrayed, with banners broad above displayed, according to heraldic rites. Upon the field of battle, knights were dubbed by good King Robert's sword, Sir Walter Stewart and the Lord of Douglasdale, and more besides. All noble men of valour tried, when all was done, as I have said, they went to battle well arrayed. Many brave warriors, true and good, eager to prove their hardihood, under their banners you might see, advance to battle openly. The English, on the other side, as bright as angels, were descried, not like the Scottish troops arrayed, but all their troops united made one solid mass, perhaps because the battlefield so narrow was, that they had little room to spread. Well, does that reflect what we see in front of us? I would suggest it does. Hemmed in by the two streams here. Certainly no room to spread. Are there any others? Well, the Vita Edwardi, another chronicler, he talks about Robert the Bruce when he says, Robert the Bruce let his whole army out of the wood, and not one was on horseback. So here we have the Balquhdderock wood. Now this whole area along the escarpment here, seen in the green, was wooded. So Robert the Bruce has had to come down through the 30-degree slope, through the woods, and down onto the flat Carselands, tying in with what the Vita says. Are there any more? Well, the Scala Chronica. The aforesaid Scots came in line of schiltrons and attacked the English columns, which were jammed together and could not operate against them. So direfully were their horses impaled on the pikes. The troops in the English rear fell back upon the ditch of Bannockburn, tumbling one over the other. So once again, they had no room to manoeuvre, and the troops in the back, once they were getting pushed back, fell upon the ditch of the Bannockburn. So that ties in as well. So what happened when the two actually confronted, when they clashed together? Going back to Barber, and here he's talking about Walter Stewart and James Douglas, and the clash of the enemies there. Their enemies received them well, I promise, with swords, maces and spears. The battle there was most fierce, and so mighty was the spilling of blood that it stood in pools on the ground. The Scots bore themselves so well, and made so great a slaughter, and reft the lives from so many, that all the field was left bloody. At that time, the three Scottish divisions were fighting well nigh side by side. There one might hear right many a stroke, and weapons striking on armour, and sea knights and steeds go down, and many a rich and splendid garment fouled roughly under foot. Some kept their feet, some lost their lives. So we know that for some time there was a furious battle going on at the front here, and it remained in a state of stalemate for quite some time, because at the end of the day you did have overwhelming numbers of English there, and although the ones at the back couldn't quite get to the front or outflank the Scots, there was still lots more of them, and in due course that would tire the Scots out. But they held on manfully, and eventually they pushed into the English, pushing them back. So what happened then? Well, we have the Walter Boer in the Scotch Chronicon. He says, between the stony stream and the obstruction of their camp, the treacherous English people came to grief as a result of their own dishonest conduct. Does that tie in with what we see? Well, here we have the camp, or somewhere in this area, certainly behind English, and you can see that they fled in all directions, and that's mentioned in a number of chroniclers. They fled in disorder. It wasn't a united retreat, it was total chaos. The battle had turned into a rout. So they came to grief between the obstruction of their camp and the stony stream. And we know here that this is a non-tidal part of the Bannockburn, and it can be described as a stony stream. However, after the confluence where it becomes tidal, if you look at the Bannockburn down here today, you will see that it's silt-filled and muddy, and certainly can't be described as the stony stream. So once again, something else is matching up to what we see on the map and on the ground in front of us. Well, the battle raged mightily, and the Scots pushed on to the extent where they were actually tugging at the reins of King Edward II's horse. The English king was in dire danger of being captured by the Scots, and his generals decided the best thing to do was get him off the field, and he fled from the field towards Stirling Castle. And obviously once the king had fled, it's bound to have affected the morale of the others, who were already starting to break. They were already under immense pressure, under the Scots' aggression and the Scots' attack. They had never come across anything like it, and they were struggling. And once our king fled, well, it was pretty much all over then. So let's listen to John Barber again. And when they knew their king was fled, the English would no longer stay. By different paths they broke away, so hotly by the Scotsmen chased, that in their panic-stricken haste they kept no order in their ranks. Some hurrying to the river banks threw themselves into the Forth, and there the most part of them drowned were. The burn of Bannock soon was filled with all the men and horses killed, stepping on which the waters broad you might have passed with feet dry shod. So here we have Barber telling you that it was a route that they fled in all directions in total disarray. From here up towards the Forth, where the best part were drowned. Across the Bannockburn, where it was filled with so many horse and bodies, you could walk across dry shod. So once again, a number of chronicles here describing the area we see in front of us here on the Carseland, between the Pelstream Burn and the Bannockburn, describing quite well. Under the weight of evidence, we have to accept that this is, by quite some considerable distance, the most likely area for Day 2 of the Battle of Bannockburn on the 24th of June 1314. Have we found any proof of that? Well, some time ago, during an archaeological dig, Neil Oliver and the guy Pollard, they did find in this area the stirrup of a horse, a spur from its rider, and a cross, a trinket from the decoration on the horse. So it's not a lot, but it is something that suggests they were in this area. It ties in with what the chroniclers tell us. So there you go. Under weight of evidence, we have to accept that the area we see in front of us here, between the Pelstream and the Bannockburn, at the northern edge of Balquhdderock Wood, was the Carselands, where Day 2 of the battle was carried out, and a famous victory won by King Robert the Bruce.